In 1991, the world and most Arab and Muslim countries seemed content for American and Allied forces to intervene and kick the invading Saddam out of Kuwait. The Palestinians, however, were seen by local Kuwaitis as having backed the wrong side. Once the Iraqis were ousted, the revenge began.
They were rounded up, there was execution halls, they were beaten to death by mobs, they were burned alive, and it was a ferocious response. Yasser Arafat at the time said that what the Kuwaitis have done to the Palestinians is worse than what the Israelis have ever done in the occupied territories. But again, very few people know this. It doesn't influence attitudes in the West. No one takes to the streets, because the bottom line is that the only people that can worry the West when it comes to Palestinian suffering is Israel.
It's a lamentable fact that no one ever stormed the barricades over the massacres in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon or Kuwait. And any honest lefty with a memory knows that's true. The only oppressor who counted was the Zionist oppressor.
The complaint really isn't that the left supports Palestinians. It should. It should also support progressive Israelis. And it should support those Palestinians who are looking for a two-state solution.
By the late 80s, the tactic of terror was replaced by a mass movement of ordinary Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, who rose in largely unarmed revolt against Israeli occupation. The Intifada seemed a desperately unequal battle.
No question that most people's mind in Israel, from the center through to the left, and even people now in the center-right, that the Palestinians suffered an injustice and that it's necessary to solve that problem through the creation of a genuinely viable, independent Palestinian state.
The first Intifada, with its images of heavily armed Israeli soldiers breaking the arms of stone-throwing Palestinian kids, helped to transform the political situation in Israel. Sympathy for the Palestinians was expressed by Israelis themselves in Peace Now, a remarkable popular mass movement demanding recognition of Palestinian rights and a negotiated peace settlement.
People began to see that the occupation and the annexation, creeping annexation was going on, were no longer viable, that the brutalization of the Palestinian population couldn't continue. And that was exactly the point at which the mainstream Israeli left, like Peace Now and associated groups, became particularly powerful.
The politics of Peace Now found an echo amongst Palestinian moderates. Yitzhak Rabin, the man who'd ordered the arm breaking, came to understand the need for Israeli concessions and, tearing up many of his own most bellicose speeches, struck a deal with the Palestinians.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
Such a peace was anathema to the rejectionists on both sides, who wanted nothing more than annihilation for the other side. Yitzhak Rabin was murdered leaving a peace rally by Jewish terrorists. It was precisely when the air was pregnant with the possibility of peace, fundamentalist Islamist Hamas first sent deluded young Palestinians laden with explosives to rip at the heart of Israeli society and of the peace process. And you would think that such terrible and counterproductive violence would meet with utter condemnation from all who call themselves progressive. You'd be wrong.
Very few people actually justify it. Most people will say, we disapprove of it, but, and the but, of course, then cancels out the disapproval.
There is a fundamental problem when the left is unable to say, I condemn the bombing of civilians, I condemn the use of children as suicide bombers, and I condemn the use of suicide bombers who are blowing up children.
The Hamas Charter is not ambiguous. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Not peace, obliteration. So Hamas sent their human bombs to obliterate Israelis, Jews and Arabs in shopping centres, on buses full of school children, in restaurants and nightclubs.
The bloody 12 hours began with the killing of teenagers in the centre of Jerusalem. The devices that they detonated simultaneously contained nuts and bolts, a hail of shrapnel that cut down dozens of people.
Such actions could never be justified, but they could be understood. Not as the deliberate strategy of far-right religious groups opposed to peace, but as the almost natural response of the weak when dealing with the strong.
All of a sudden we now hear that in their struggle against the strong, the weak have no other weapons but terrorism. It's not true.
Some demented liberals have even said that if they were Palestinians, they might do the same thing.
I think it's because there's a very strong streak of what Edward Said used to call Orientalism within the British left. That is a stereotype view of how Asians, Muslims and Arabs actually operate. And the constant attempt to explain that suicide bombing, for instance, is understandable, that if I were in a refugee camp, I would do it, is of course actually contains a rather coded racist message. It basically saying, well, that's what you'd expect of Muslims and Arabs, isn't it?
I think the account that's given of suicide bombing is that this is the only way in which people can fight against the oppressive, occupying power. It seems to me that's just false.
The left should have a moral benchmark. We should be the people who stand up and say, don't do that, enough is enough, that's not justified. And one of the things where we should draw that line is around the bombing of civilians, and particularly civilian children.
A terrifying conjuncture has been created between a long-term Arab sense of victimhood and grievance, some of it justified, and a religious super-zealotry. The end result is a cult of death.
Therefore, I'm going to talk to you in a language that you understand. Our words are dead until we give them life with our blood.
I find it difficult to believe that God could possibly be pleased with people who try to secure their own salvation by way of killing innocents.
The slaughter unleashed by Hamas didn't even aim at a solution as we might understand it. It was designed both to kill as many Jews as possible and to sabotage any chance of a peaceful settlement being reached.
The most telling statistic in these terms is that between 94 and 96, there was more anti-Israel terrorism when the peace process was at its height than between 96 and 99 when the peace process was stalled.
But far from these tactics increasing left support for a peace process, it seems to have hardened the feeling that it is Israel and Israel alone that is the problem. And once the left found itself able to make excuses for Palestinian suicide bombers, it wasn't long before they also found themselves understanding religious fundamentalism and fascist terrorism closer to home.
We mustn't start to try and understand in terms of justifying the action. Understanding to try and prevent any future is one thing, but understanding in terms of justification is dangerous territory, I think.
Budia loves to run. He says he can't help himself. He's just 4 years old. Budia runs in 90-degree heat and without drinking a drop of water. Budia runs about 20 miles every day. Budia loves to run. Someone once told him to start, but shouldn't someone now make him stop? Extraordinary People, the 4-year-old who ran 40 miles. 9 o'clock Monday on 5.